You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. Please remember that subscribing to our podcast on iTunes is the best way to support our show. Those of you who are already subscribers, we thank you. And those of you who aren't, we thank you in advance. You can also subscribe on Stitcher, Player FM, and SoundCloud, or find us on YouTube. If you like what you hear, tweet it out with the hashtag BHPhotoPodcast. And with 2017 and our 100th episode behind us, prepare with us for 2018 with guests that include actor-photographer Norman Reedus, photographer Chris Buck, and our quickly approaching Canon sweepstakes. Stay tuned. Today we're going to be delving into the world of artists and galleries. And to that end, John Harris and I have not one, but two guests. Cig Harvey is a multi-award-winning fine art and commercial photographer whose work is in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the George Eastman House, and others. She shot campaigns for New York Magazine, Kate Spade, and Bloomingdale's, and she has published 3 monographs. You Look at Me Like an Emergency in 2012, Gardening at Night in 2015, and You and Orchestra, You a Bomb in 2017. I love the names. The last 2 monographs were published in conjunction with solo shows at the Robert Mann Gallery here in New York City, which leads us to our second guest. Caroline Wall is the director of the Robert Mann Gallery, one of the preeminent photography galleries in the world. Caroline graduated from McGill University in Montreal and began her career in the art world at the O'Hara Gallery in 2002. In 2006, she began working at Robert Mann Gallery. A longtime admirer of Cig Harvey's work, Caroline began working with the artist in 2014 and hosted the gallery's first exhibition of Harvey's work in a show titled Gardening at Night back in 2015. With a diverse roster that highlights both contemporary artists and a collection of 20th century masters, the Robert Mann Gallery sees its mission to interrogate the role of the photographic medium to capture or invent, purify or distort, and to take on new identities. Harry Callahan, Ansel Adams, Walker Evans, Diane Arbus, Michael Kenna, W. Gene Smith, and of course our guest Cig Harvey are just a few of the artists handled by the Robert Mann Gallery. That said, I'd like to start by reading a little segment that you put in. There's some wonderful written portions in your book, You and Orchestra, You a Bomb. And the quote I want to start with is, "In my 20s, I wear vintage dresses every day. 1940s ball gowns to get coffee, fringed flappers to the post office. They're itchy and smell of someone else's transgressions, but I am fearless and my life is a photograph. When I turned 40, I retired them all in favor of tight jeans and high boots." Then you go on with the final line, which is the killer. It says, "I like the idea of the moths taking back the clothes of these women, slowly making dust of our stories." Wow. That's what a photograph is. When I read that, the first thing that struck me is that you look through this book, you look at any photograph, and there's a very good chance that what you're looking at no longer exists. The leaves on the trees are gone. The stream has dried up. The snow is gone. People have grown older and maybe passed on. That's very powerful. And you seem to have a lot of this driving your work.
Well, first of all, it was wonderful to hear you read that. I've only ever sort of read it in my head, so thank you for that.
By the way, if you'd like me to read the rest, just call me. I have spare time. I'll be happy to read any part of this book to you at any time.
This is Story Hour with Alan Weitz. I like it.
I love it. I think as photographers, I've thought a lot about this, and I think photographers, our currency is time. That's what we deal with. Yeah. And inherently, there's a part of us that are very romantic typically. And I think that sort of lends itself to this notion of time. And I remember something that was really profound for me. Ernesto Bazan, in his book on Cuba, he added up all of the, typically he made pictures at 250th of a second, whatever f-stop it needed to be. And he added up all those 250ths of a second, and his entire life work came to 4.6 seconds.
Oh, my God.
Right? Dealing with this minutia and trying to sort of shine a light on perhaps much bigger things with these fragments of time. So I think that currency of time with photography is just a really interesting one to sort of think about.
And is this something that is new to this series, examining these kind of fleeting moments and these fragile moments? Do you feel a new relationship with time in this work as opposed to the other ones?
Well, I think, my work has always been involved with this idea of fragility. And, in earlier work, I think I looked at sort of relationships, whether relationships with my husband or my mother or with my daughter. This newer work is more about my relationship with life itself. So I do think, and I think that's sort of a natural part perhaps of, getting older, of having a child myself. So I think that this new work does deal with this idea of time and how fragile and short and precious our lives are more than the rest of the work, I think, yes.
Are you more at peace with yourself at this point as far as how you're approaching pictures? Because a lot of your earlier work seems to be reactions to trauma in your life or dramatic things that have happened.
Yeah, I think I've always seen my photography as sort of, and with students I work with, to this idea of is it a balance? Is it a scale, or is it a mirror? Sometimes our pictures reflecting back exactly what we're going through, and other times it's the opposite. Photography can become an escapism, for example, or you go to the opposite. So when in times of my life that have been the most difficult, my pictures have never looked more beautiful. So I use photography as a way to sort of seek out wonder in the world and seek out beauty. And other times when I'm more stable, happier, maybe it's so bold to say, the work becomes darker and I'm able to look at things in a different way. So it's that idea of the scale and the balance that's reflected through the lens.
And the idea that you mentioned, how you're looking at life now, was this something that you decided you would do, or at what point in the series did you realize what you were doing? And is that something that you can speak on regarding all of the work you do? Do you, I should say, when does an idea become a series?
Well, that's it's a beautiful question. I think for me, I just make work and I sort of pour everything into it and I make as much as I can as a way of seeing, as a way of understanding. I've always said that photography, making pictures, is my way of slowing the world down, being able to sort of stop it for that fragment of time and then having this 2D beautiful piece of paper where I can look at what am I thinking? What are my hopes or my fears or, my joys. So typically how I work is I write a lot as a way to sort of raise consciousness. I write and that's more of a brainstorming, just stream of consciousness. And then I just go out completely separately trying to make pictures. And then I sort of bring it all back to the studio and spend time looking, well, why was I drawn to that place? Why did I love photographing that woman or this person? And I spend a lot of time thinking about why I'm drawn to the things that I'm drawn, or why do I like this picture more than another photograph? But even so, I do believe that our lives are reflected by what we're drawn to in the cameras. Even so, with this new work, I was probably a year into making this work before I realized it was so, had come out of, I did have a car accident in 2015 that was traumatic. And rather than process it in words, I went out and inadvertently, my subconscious sort of made these pictures that were a response to it, where I was feeling the need to shine a light on all that was sort of amazing about the world and magical about the world, but how fragile that felt. So there was this sort of, I was seeking out in the photographs this push-pull, this idea of the gasp, where we gasp when something is beautiful, but we also gasp as a reflex when something's terrible. So sort of finding that line.
Mm-hmm. And the way you described you going out and photographing and the things that you're drawn to, Was there, at least in the case of this series, was there ever anything predetermined about that, in the sense that today I'm going to go shoot so-and-so, or I'm going to follow such and such, or take this path, or was it just part of the day-to-day?
Well, it's both, really. I work in two ways. I think of my job is to make the unseen, that's what's in our heads, seen visually through a photograph. So I found, for me, working in two ways, both constructing and finding, really helps me make the most images. If I only make the pictures I know I can make by constructing, then my world gets smaller. And so I use sort of getting in my car, going out in the world and responding, just, not realizing where it fits. And there's no, I'm not planning or predetermining what I'm getting, as a way to sort of expand my world and who I meet, but bringing them all back. So, I work in both ways, this idea of constructing and finding and then putting them together.
Now, you spent a year taking pictures in a room.
I did.
More or less solitary. That's kind of the opposite of what you described, because you're not going to, there's a limit to how much you could find, I guess, if you're going to be, maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe that's a bad assumption. If you're going to be photographing in the same room every single day, I mean, do you still discover new things, or at what point do you start, meddling with what's going on to make a picture?
Right. I love that. Well, I spent a year in a room. I mean, it wasn't literally.
I know you had to get out once in a while. I know that.
Yeah, I went. But I was 26. It was 2002. So this is a long time ago. What I was just referencing of going out in the world, that is my process now. Mm-hmm. But in 2000, around 99, 2000, 2002, I mean, I spent a lot of time being very inward. Really, at that point, I had discovered what I was trying to do. Instead of going out in the world and telling stories, I was trying to tell my story, and quite a specific one. Being in one room and taking responsibility and ownership for everything in the frame, kind of like a painter would, for me was a new way of working back then. And I loved it. I would work in these long accordion journals and mind map and brainstorm and think about, well, what is the metaphor? What is the light I want to use to tell this story? What are the symbolisms? This idea that our museums are full of this secret language of art, that a cardinal can mean jealousy. And I was new to this world. I was 25, 26, and I just wanted to tell these stories. So for me, that time, I look back on it, was very magical. It was very inward. I think by sort of staying in one place, I was able to go in deeper. I still work in that way too now. I work in both ways.
And for somebody who is familiar with or used to constructing scenes and taking the introspective look, when you're out in the world and let's say you see an image that you want, but you miss it, it passes you, or there's a technical problem or something happens, how do you react? Do you just let it go? Have you learned to just let it go, or do you feel the need to recreate?
No, I feel terrible. I'm like mad at myself. Certain images, that I feel like the more you work with photography, the more you give to it, the more it gives back. So if you haven't been making enough recently, I feel like I do miss things. I'm clunky. Sort of the first time back in the darkroom for a while, it's not flowing. But the more I make, I feel like the more adept I am at sort of responding to situations. If I miss it, I've got to keep trying. Certain images have haunted me for years, and they still haunt me. And I'm good, and that's why photography, even after all these years, I love it so much, because there's always new pictures to make. There's always new stories to tell. And then other times you get the gift where you got it. And that's also a beautiful thing too. So, I might try and reconstruct it, or at least be aware of it again, so that I'm more available. I mean, I work with cameras that I always have a camera on me, a little one, so that, as well as my bigger one, so that, it's never because I don't miss it because I didn't have a camera with me. That would be sad.
I get the impression that most of the work that you're doing is a larger body of work. They're almost one frame at a time movies. They're stories. They're narratives. But you did just mention that every once in a while you'll go out and get a shot and you go, that's it, I got it. How often do you find you take yourself a photograph that is the entire story by itself, does not need further elaboration or a longer narrative?
Yeah. Well, I would hope in some ways that each of them work individually. I think my love of storytelling is what sort of pushes me to make books and to combine words and images together. So I think that's more just, me wanting to bring together all of the things that I love. But I would hope that, they work individually on their own as well.
Oh, no, they do for sure. That's one of the things I wanted to qualify is that as standalones, each of your photographs do hold up very beautifully. They don't need the other ones to lean on to justify themselves. And as a body of work, they hold up even stronger or equally strong.
Thanks. I feel like this idea as well of bringing in the text, I think hopefully the text works on its own and the text and the images don't need each other. They don't describe each other, but together perhaps they come to more than the sum of their parts. That's always my hope and goal anyway.
There's a simplicity to your pictures. There's not a lot of fancy fireworks and tricks and manipulation going on, at least nothing that's obvious. What are you shooting with? What kind of gear are you using?
Thank you for that. I think that is something that I always sort of strive for, to make something that sort of appears in a way harmonious and in a simple way, in many ways. I use a couple of different cameras. I use a Sony RX1R Mark II for my everyday in my bag camera, which I love because it's small. And then I have a Pentax 645Z, wow, which is a medium format digital, which I use for, I'm going to make pictures today, more specific shoots. But typically I work with one at a time. I worked with a Hasselblad for 15 years, one camera, one lens. The little Sony I have is a fixed lens. I really feel that cameras are just expensive pencils. And
yeah,
I do. And it's like, what do you have to say with them? That is the definition, I think, of art is, you're trying to communicate an idea. And so it's what we have to say with these expensive pencils. So use whichever one helps you make the most pictures. So for me, I had a big sort of transition moving from film to digital because it felt so freeing. I felt like I was one of the last to make the transition. And then it felt so freeing. I could make work at night in the snow. And, I was so used to 100 ISO speed color film overexposed to get the saturation that, it had bogged me down. So I think, I'm very free with my cameras. I'm very hard on my cameras. They look like they're 100 years old after 1 year, but they are used. And I keep it really as simple as possible because I don't want to be messing around with like switching lenses and missing something. I want the pictures to feel different as my work evolves because the stories and the ideas are different rather than the camera.
Do you ever get the urge to go back to film? I'm just curious.
I have all my old cameras. I leave there on a shelf so I can walk by them and
they can yell at you.
I know I do feel bad, but never say never in photography. That's the one thing I've learned with this amazing medium that you have to be in it for a lifetime to do anything more than scratch the surface because there's so many avenues. So I think I probably will. I'll shoot. I have a 4x5 Linhof that's sort of looking at me right now. And so I feel like I will absolutely shoot film if the story demands it. Right now, I'm still responding to the world with my digital cameras, and that's working for me. But I would never say never.
And not wanting to get too deep into the gear or even ask you to put a number on this, but between the Sony, which the format normally, depending on the settings you use, is rectangular, and the Pentax, which is not exactly square, but what is used mostly in the book or in this series? And is there something that you can talk about in terms of like image per image, or is it kind of obvious when we look at it, which is something you grabbed with the Sony and something you set up more with the Pentax?
I don't know. I could test you. Perhaps you could tell me. For me, I use, the Sony is the one that's in my bag at all times. So those are perhaps images where I'm responding. And then the Pentax is more when I'm constructing. But I'm hoping that you wouldn't be able to see the difference between the work. I really feel like it's the ideas, not the camera, that tell the stories. Right. They're just the tools. They're just the pencils to to give us access to these ideas.
But regarding, let's say, for example, the format, which in the book anyway, and in the gallery show, where the images are all square, is this something that you're cropping later, or can you speak a bit to the post process, as we call it?
Yeah, absolutely. I fell in love with the square in the late 90s. And so for me, there was sort of this idea of the commitment. I'm big into the discipline of art. And so, there's something about having the discipline of the square that I really responded to, and that maybe that won't be for always, but I have stuck to that shape as a way. It just feels right for me right now, and has done for a long time. I typically try and make everything in camera. I liken the Photoshop and the post work very much to what I would do in the wet darkroom. I taught, color printing, black and white printing for a number of years, and I really my first love was actually being in the darkroom. I love everything about it. I love the lighting situation. I love the babbling brook of the water. I love the smell of stop bath, all of that stuff. So. And music, listening to music.
I was going to ask, what do you listen to when you're in there?
All different, but just making things, making objects, physical objects that aren't on a screen. That to me, the print, this idea of this beautiful object is really important to me. So I try and keep my post work down to a minimum. I try and make it all in camera. Obviously, there's some dodging and burning and tweaking here and there, but I really try. I think one of my main missions is to remind myself and maybe others, hopefully, that the world is a sort of magical, beautiful, can be beautiful place. And so for me, it's really important I make it in camera. That works for me. I mean, I love other Photoshop work, but that's not for me. For me, I want to find it and be a witness in the world. So that's really important.
Okay. And when it gets down to editing for the series, or for, in the case of the monograph, do you need to print the images first and kind of scatter them about and look at them, or is this something that's all done on the computer?
Oh, absolutely, the former. Mm-hmm. So when my studio is at home, and I love that division of art and life. So, I make a stew, and then I, might respond to an email to Caroline, and then we'll take my dog for a walk, and then I'll go and make pictures. And there's this sort of seamless integration of my work and living. But when it comes to laying out for the books, I have to print everything. And then I go into a completely empty room, basically lay out all the written vignettes and all the photographs. And it's like this jigsaw puzzle that is brutal, and I can't have anything else in the room. It has to be these physical objects, these prints that then start talking to each other of where they need to be. So it's a much different process than the making of the pictures.
And can you speak then to maybe an image, without getting specific if you don't want to, but an image that you pulled out, and that maybe it was one of the last images you decided it was not going to make the cut, and why, and is that have to do with the formal elements and trying to continue, or is it more the narrative? And again, it's getting back to what Alan spoke about earlier, the idea of one image that can stand on its own. Maybe that one just didn't stand on its own, but it worked with the narrative, but it still had to get out. Are there any examples you can speak of regarding that?
Absolutely. I think for this idea, I believe that in order for an image to be successful, it has to have both form and content. If it's all content, then we're just being lectured to. If it's all form, then perhaps it's a postcard. So this idea of the collision of form and content coming together to tell the story. And I think that certain times that images got edited out, that they just felt like should belong in a different group, or that, wasn't speaking in the same way, in harmony with the others. So absolutely, images were edited out for the book, and maybe they'll appear at a later date in another book.
Do you trust your own editing skills? Because that's a tough one. I don't say that as a joke, but right. Do you edit your own work, or do you rely on the thoughts of others, or both?
Well, both. I mean, what I do is I have this big wall in my studio where I have date nights with my pictures. So just in the computer, I print them out, and I make all my students do this too. And, and I sit in front of them, and it's this process of of, I don't know, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, 60 minutes, 70 minutes, 80 minutes, 90 minutes, 100 minutes, 200 minutes, 300 minutes, 400 minutes, 500 minutes, 600 minutes, 700 minutes, 800 minutes, 900 minutes, 1000 minutes, 2000 minutes, 3000 minutes, 4000 minutes, 5000 minutes, 6000 minutes, 7000 minutes, 8000 minutes, 9000 minutes, 100 minutes, 200 minutes, 300 minutes, 400 minutes, 500 minutes, 600 minutes, 700 minutes, 800 minutes, 900 minutes, 1000 minutes, 2000 minutes, 3000 minutes, 4000 minutes, 5000 minutes, 6000 minutes, 7000 minutes, 8000 minutes, 100 minutes, 200 minutes, 300 minutes, 400 minutes, 500 minutes, 600 minutes, 700 minutes, 8000 minutes, think, see, listen. Listen to what the pictures are telling me rather than just like barreling on and making more. Like what's reflecting back. So, think, see, make, listen. Think, see, make, listen. I liken it to like driving at night, right? We trust that our headlights will, we trust that the road won't stop, that the headlights will illuminate the part that we need. And so I feel like the pictures themselves illuminate the direction forward. So what I do, I spread them all out on and pin them up and, straight into the wall. I don't worry about ruining the wall. And that's a really free part for me.
Wow. You are a great interview. I just want to tell you right now, you are a terrific interview. It's wonderful.
But I'd read that you spoke, and this is going back earlier in your career when you found community and structure as a way to go forward with your photography. But you also speak about working solitarily. Who do you bring in at the editing process to speak to? Who do you bounce ideas off of? Is it your students, other photographers, your husband?
Right. Yes. That was the other part of the question, wasn't it? I didn't answer it. So once I pick things up and I might be torn between one or four, that's when I do have a small group of people that I trust, and Caroline is definitely
so sitting
one.
Quietly over here smiling.
Hi, Caroline. How you been?
Good.
I say, what do you think of this? Which one? And I trust her implicitly. So for me, it's really important to have that feedback. I don't always need it, but it's lovely to have that relationship where I can ask someone I trust, and I know that they'll be honest with me. And I have to say, she's always right.
Well, while we're here, can I jump over to you, Caroline, and ask you? I mean, when she poses this question to you, what questions do you ask yourself in terms of, I like this because... Mm-hmm. I don't mean to be straight up commercial, but is it good for the gallery, or does it fit the narrative, or I love it? I mean, how do you temper your answers and give feedback?
Well, it has to be all of those things.
Okay.
And it's something I really enjoy when I start getting images like that and we go back and forth and she's asking my opinion. Maybe she sends me 3 or 4 takes of something that's changed very slightly, but there's a very different feeling in all of them. And it's usually very instinctive. Mm-hmm. Cig's work really resonates with me. That's, from the moment I saw it, I wanted to work with her work. Right. And so I think having a real instinctive reaction when you see something to how it's going to be part of a series, how people are going to receive it, how it's going to be part of an exhibition is probably the most important part, because it's that real on-the-spot reaction. And that's usually how I make the decision. I'll sit with them for a minute. They're on my screen. I'll spread them out. I'll think, and then I'll make a quick decision. And we'll go back and forth, which is so much fun. Mm-hmm. We'll a flurry of emails and text messages, right, Cig? Mm-hmm. Back and forth when we kind of start that process, and it's a lot of fun. It's a privilege.
Have you gone up to Cig's space and gone through the process where you're staring at the wall with her yet?
I haven't yet. Okay. I hope to do that one of these days.
That's great.
Yes.
and you had mentioned various takes of certain images. Can you speak to, and again, without being too specific or silly with this question, a ratio of what you shoot and what boils down? It must change depending on the camera and the moment. Of course, I realize that, but is there something you can speak on that, Cig?
Well, Cig, can I just chime in? One thing that I'm remembering when you were working on this series was the cake. I don't know if you want to use that as an example, but that was a really wonderful, because we went back and forth a lot on that. And as I remember, there were 3, 4 images. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I liked them all for different reasons, and they were all quite different. And then ultimately, the one that was selected for the book was the one that just felt right in the sequence. But and also, do you remember the Scout in the Blizzard image?
Yes.
Which there were other ones, and I think Caroline helped me. Sometimes I have my mommy goggles on. This idea that. Is this a great picture, or is it a great picture of my daughter? And so help having that sort of second opinion of just this one is more universal, and I think it's just really, really useful to have someone you trust to give you honest feedback.
How often does it come up where people are not resonating with a picture that just knocks your socks off? Does that happen at all? Oh, I just got a nod over here.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, sometimes the image that you think is going to be the one that everybody jumps at isn't. And, it's your interaction with a picture is so personal. And these very fragile, beautiful moments, I think, take on a different meaning for every viewer. So maybe something that I have a really strong reaction to, and I'm like, that's the one, isn't necessarily the one that people jump at.
Well, that's what I find also. That's why I asked about self-editing, because I think I could look at my work and be pretty objective about it, but I might be totally fooling myself too. But I know that there are times when I've said, okay, that picture, I love it, but it doesn't belong here, and that's a tough thing. I think you have to be very comfortable with yourself and confident in your work to be able to say it's a good picture, but it's not good enough. Even if it has a great story behind it, maybe it's just the story behind it.
Yeah, it's hard to get rid of.
That's hard to do.
Yeah.
Or just that it's a wonderful picture that doesn't flow in a narrative in book form.
Exactly.
Maybe in a completely different, maybe on the wall of a gallery would have a completely different feeling.
Right.
Which is a question I had, and I'll just jump to right now. I mean, in your head when you're making this, is there a final product? Is it a gallery or is it a book, or do you just
it's
need
both.
to? It's both.
It's all. I mean, that's what's so beautiful about this medium is that, it can be all, and a book is a very different experience than a gallery show. A book is this sort of personal, one-on-one time. There's a picture distance that happens, and people expect to read in Western culture from left to right, and you can take people. The pictures are bound. There's a sequence that is more precise than perhaps in a gallery. In a gallery setting, but I love that it can be both of those things, and really, that's something I really strive for, that they both can be successful.
Absolutely.
What's more daunting, if I may ask, putting together a book or a show? Is there a difference in far as what your antsiness and anticipation goes into it, the amount of energy?
Well, I think I pour the same amount of energy into both. There's something about, I've always said that an ISBN number is forever.
Yeah.
Which I love that part. I love this responsibility of that. But shows are often a collaborative experience where, Caroline and I worked together on the sequence of the show and the book. Actually, she helped me very much with the sequencing. But I think with the gallery, Caroline knows the space better than I know the space, so I'm relying on her to sort of help me with that part of it. So they're quite different experiences. I mean, with this show that's currently up at Robert Mann, we had text put onto the walls, and that's really exciting. That's one of the first times I've done that, and I'm really happy with how that looks, so that it almost becomes like walking into a big book.
How do you know when a project is over? Or how do you feel, or is it something that comes imposed on, okay, we need to get the book to the publisher and the gallery's booked and all that stuff?
A couple of things here. There's a natural progression where in my studio, the pictures start to feel different. So there's sort of this natural, there's sort of a natural chapter ending. Although I would say also that my work is sort of one long continuous line in many ways, because it's a mirror of whatever I'm sort of dealing with, thinking about, it's, this sort of simple life being lived. So I do think that sometimes the 3 books could actually be one big book. But who knows? I mean, I think that, for me, that the pictures start to feel different.
Okay. And Cig, am I remembering correctly, in all 3 of the books, there's a little bit of crossover, right?
Yes.
From one series to the next, which I think is interesting.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, and we're going to come back with more with Cig Harvey and Caroline Wall. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. Send us a tweet at BHPhotoVideo, #BHPhotoPodcast.
Okay, we are back. Can you tell us when you first discovered Cig's work and what struck you about it? I mean, how'd you guys cross paths?
So I believe that I first saw Cig's work at an art fair. I was trying to remember when I first saw it, but I remember seeing it several times, probably over several years, and it stayed with me. It really resonated with me and kept finding myself going back to look at her work, Googling her, looking at her website. Do you remember the
series? Was it black and white work? Or?
It would have been from You Look at Me Like an Emergency, because the first show that we did together was gardening.
Right.
So I kept going back to it, kept looking at her website, kept thinking about her work, and then it was sort of at that point when you, I think, feel like you really identify with something, that you feel like you have a real connection with it. That's around when I met Cig for the first time in person, and it was really shortly after that we started working together. So that would have been in, I think we started working together in 2014, and then we had her first solo show in 2015.
And is this something that at the beginning was more of on a personal level, and then you said, you know what, you spoke to your colleagues and you said, let's take this to the next level?
I think I, as I recall, I had seen it sort of myself just walking around and kept thinking on it. And sometimes that's just the way that it happens. You see something.
What's the process then that would bring her into the gallery then, as opposed to just an artist whose work resonates with you?
Well, I think, part of sort of sitting with it and revisiting it over a period of time is looking at the progression in the work, seeing how the staying power with you and how you feel about the work. And then, of course, thinking about how to market it and how best to approach, our audience with that work. And so at that point, I met Cig for the first time, and we had a really great rapport, and the conversation just kind of naturally evolved from there. And I think the first time we had the opportunity to exhibit her work, if I'm not mistaken, was in Paris at the fair in 2014, and then followed by her solo show with us.
Now, I'd imagine, obviously, in your position, you are bombarded with imagery. Either that you're seeing randomly just walking down the streets, or people sending you stuff and knocking on the door and badgering you at parties and whatever else. How often do you stumble upon somebody of Cig's caliber where you keep triggering me saying, no, this is the real deal, this works for me?
I mean, to be honest, not very often. It has to be something that really sings to you to make you keep going back, because like you said, we do look at so much work. But on the other hand, that's what we do. That's what we're used to doing, is seeing a lot of work, so we can kind of digest it that way. And in one way that helps, because we can digest something quickly or something really stays with us. And that's when you kind of know that you're finding something special and exciting.
Interesting. And so having worked with her already in another series, was there kind of an open invitation for when the next series is done, we're going to put your show up, or how's that process work?
Sure. So that's a really interesting question. I have the great privilege with Cig that she shares things with me along the way.
Just to cut you off, I'm sorry, but
Sure.
Clearly you guys are friends. You have a great working relationship. What if that wasn't the case? I mean, the work was there, you love the work, you spoke to it, but the relationship wasn't good. Is that going to affect, obviously it'll affect to some degree, but how it goes forward?
No, I don't think so, because ultimately it's about the work. Of course, it makes it so much fun when you have such a great rapport with somebody. Yeah. But at the end of the day, it's about the work. And
well, for the most part, artists are pretty even-keeled. So that shouldn't be much of a problem, I would imagine, right?
Exactly.
You're dealing with rational people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Podcast host too. But so in going forward for this particular series.
Yes. So being in that really wonderful position where Cig shares things with me along the way, when I know what's developing with her, when she'll share with me that she's going through a period of making pictures, or she'll show me what she's started, and I can see where things are progressing to. I know what's coming, I know. So it's not like she will be quiet for a year and then all of a sudden I'm presented with a new series. So it's sort of a different thing than that, because we know where we are. We've even probably had the opportunity to show a couple of pictures at different art fairs along the way before the series is complete. And that gives us a real clue to
testing
what
the waters a little bit
exactly, and what the show is going to look like and how things are going to develop. Now, of course, that can be a surprise how things develop, depending on what she's working on.
Do you ever try to influence any, not necessarily Cig, but any of the artists, as far as if they say a show is coming up and they're showing you work of different things, do you ever try to influence them one way or the other? I mean, obviously they're asking you an opinion because you are part of the process.
Sure.
But there's a little bit of a slim line between offering an opinion and pushing directions. Do you ever find yourself trying to influence Any of the artists?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. And no, she didn't wink at me when she said that.
And I hope they would say the same.
No, there was no wink there.
No, I don't think so, because I think
you trust them.
Trust them, absolutely.
Okay.
And that's, when you've worked with somebody for several years, and some artists for much longer than that, you know their process. You're familiar with how this is going to develop. You don't necessarily know what you're going to see at the end of it, but there's certainly a trust there to what's coming.
And for the artists that you represent, or the contemporary artists, there's only so many months out of the year.
Right.
Are they guaranteed shows? And maybe that's not the right word, but
Sure.
Are they guaranteed shows when their next series is available and done, or not necessarily?
I think we absolutely do our best when a body of work is ready and needs to be out there. We want to be part of that,
right.
For many reasons.
Right, it's mutually beneficial if it's all working out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think it's important for the artist when a body of work is ready, especially when it times with a publication like this, which is so exciting, to be able to show it in conjunction with the release of that book.
And do you have any relationship with the publisher and when the book is released and things like that, or
Through Cig.
just through Cig?
Yeah, through Cig.
All right, great.
Yeah.
So can you then talk about the edit for the gallery?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
how that works? And is there any fluidity? Do you change images?
Sometimes.
And can you speak on that?
Sure.
And, yeah.
Well, that's absolutely one of my favorite parts of the process. And in this instance with Cig and with this show and the last show, it came around the time of the release of the book. So I got to think about the book and the images and, all those factors into picking the work for the show. And I start in two ways. I have all the images in folders on my screen, and I just start moving things around, and I go very visually. I usually know a few key images that I think are going to be really important to anchor the show, and then, some other pieces that I think are, important to complete a story, or for various reasons they should be included. After I finish that process, that's usually when I send it to Cig, and she'll give me her feedback, because then she'll see something that's really missing in the story that I'm not seeing. And then, we'll go back and forth that way, and we'll come to a set of images. Probably more than we can hang. That's when I go to my little dollhouse and I print them. We print them out in tiny scale, and I
was going
literally
to ask
hang
you
the
whether
show.
you do an actual physical model or do you work in CAD?
No, I have a physical model that sits in my office, and I have little printouts, because it's, for me, it's a really great way to do it.
Yeah.
It's impulsive. I can change things quickly. I can get a sense of what I'm hoping to see and what's working, what's not working. It's a lot of fun.
I have a question for each of you regarding this. When, let's say you've made a set of decisions and you think you know what you're going to, and then the prints show up. And then you say, wait a second, that's not what I expected it to look like in this size or in the particular print.
Yeah.
Have you had that experience where then you change?
So we try to have maybe one or two extra pieces for a variety of reasons. One, maybe I didn't get the spacing right in my little model. Or maybe I have room for something that I didn't think I would, or it just really is part of the narrative that's developing in the hanging. So I think in the ideal world, there's a couple of extra pieces for that reason and for the reason that you mentioned. Maybe something's not working at that scale in the layout. That usually resolves that issue, but it's not often that we have to swap something out.
When the prints come in for you, that's the finished work, right? You're not going to say, you know what, this doesn't, I would ask,
No.
that's it. Yeah.
No. Yeah. And usually I've seen most of the prints at the 14 by 14 size. And I can, extrapolate how it's going to look larger.
Right. And Cig, when you're working on this with Caroline, and let's say you realize she's just told the same story with a fraction of the images that I've used in the book, does that ever give you pause to say, I have too many images in this book, or something along those lines?
That's a really good point. But my answer to that, I always want more. I always, the way I hang work in my house is almost like salon style. So, I think that's just my personality. And also as a photographer, I think you always, you want it to be a really full experience. What is your favorite might not be someone else's. So I love seeing how Caroline interprets and what she feels is the right amount to tell the story. And that, making art is a really solitary experience. So to have these relationships that, that where you can have conversations and learn from, I think is a really great one.
It's also interesting. There are 4 of us at the gallery, and once we've gone through this process, to hear everybody else's opinion, because that always factors in too.
Oh yeah.
I wouldn't say more opinions is always better, but a finite number is really great because you get a lot of feedback from people, and something that you're not seeing, or something that I'm not seeing from my perspective in the story that I'm kind of editing out of it will completely be seen by somebody else.
Can I ask a bit about the show that I saw? You had 2 sizes available. You had the larger prints and the smaller. And from what I understand, there's a third available for purchase. Can you discuss that decision? And is that something that Cig makes, you make in conjunction? And then why do you make different sizes?
Sure. So when we started working with Cig, she had set out her sizes and editions, and they were those 3 formats, which I think is absolutely perfect. It's great for a lot of reasons. The big ones are these wonderlands. They're just transportive. But it's nice on a number of levels to have different sizes. First of all, we live in New York. There are space constraints. And, if somebody loves the work, you don't want them to not be able to live with it because they don't have the wall space. Another thing with Cig's work that I find is that sometimes people really like to create a story out of the images. And so that might be something that they can do in a smaller scale that they wouldn't be able to just physically accommodate in a larger scale. And of course, there's the price point. It's really nice to be able to have something at different levels for different different people who are collecting for different reasons or at different price points. I think it really makes the work accessible in a lot of ways.
And Cig, is that what you're thinking when you're making these decisions also? Or do you look at it more from the artistic and formal side?
Well, both. I mean, for me, my observation is that if an image is strong, it works in a few different sizes. You can have a different experience where, as Caroline says, that idea of the wonderland, of walking into an image, as opposed to it being a more sort of personal experience. For me, I just think this idea of editioning is an important one. I love the fact that they're rare. And, they can be not rare by seeing it in a book and seeing it in a publication, but, this idea of living with something on a wall that isn't a poster, that is sort of limited to the, size and the amount produced. I actually love that part.
And you don't see one size as being the final size, the preferred size necessarily?
No, it's an interesting thought that for me, I love the experience of looking at images in books, but then sometimes, or in the smaller sizes, sometimes some details are lost that really come forward in the larger sizes. And sometimes it's surprising. Images, I think, that would work best in the smaller one, like knock my socks off when they're larger and vice versa. So
there was an image, sorry to interrupt, I think you call it Lips, that is in the gallery. And when I saw it large, it spoke to me in a different way, and specifically, it was the details of the hair under her lips. I didn't see in the book, and I didn't know if I saw it in a small print. But when I saw it large, it almost gave me a chill just seeing the hairs there, which I didn't see in any other version. So,
and I think that was one of the earliest pieces that we picked to be in the large size, right, Cig?
Yeah. And that was your decision. I liked it small, and then I saw it big, and for me, that was such a sleeper of the show. It was so strong, larger, and I didn't know it would be that way. And it's interesting because in many ways, it's a very simple picture, but that scale of 40-40, I couldn't be happier.
And are all the photos available in all the different sizes, or did you make certain decisions to say this one won't?
They are all available in all the different sizes. Okay.
Question for Cig. What can you tell us about the color red? It seems to be a very prominent color amongst your photographs, especially with dresses. And I say that because a lot of your photographs tend to have a muted, if not monochromatic palette.
Well, we could talk for the next hour about color. I love color, and in writing the introduction to You and Orchestra, You a Bomb, I realized just how much of my experiences and memories were about color. And when my daughter asked me, what's your favorite color? I say all the colors, because, have an affinity to red, but not just red. I mean, I just love this idea of the symbolism of color, the meaning behind color, how that changes from culture to culture, how to use color. I use color to sort of seduce, I think, in some ways. I have a deep-seated love of color. And so I use them all. I mean, it's not just red. I love jewel tones. I typically tend to use one color at a time. So that idea of the monochromatic color you just mentioned, I definitely do that. I probably make only a few pictures in the fall, because I actually have a really hard time with the different colors all coming together, like orange and green and all these things. I find it less harmonious. Obviously, in nature, it's perfect. But in a picture, for me, I really think I use like one major color at a time to tell the stories.
Yeah, I noticed. Yeah.
In one of the talks that I saw on YouTube, you had said that the photo you took of a child, and I'm not sure if it's Scout, but looking out of the back of a pickup truck was in perfect harmony. Can you describe in words what perfect harmony is in a photo?
Well, that photograph I made in 2009, so it's not Scout, it's Emmy.
I'm sorry, okay.
That's fine. And, for me, I think harmony in a picture is where everything has its space. It's much like, Cartier-Bresson saying that, the decisive moment, that idea that everything in the picture just had its own visual space, and sometimes it's a matter of moving our cameras, our eyes, an inch or half an inch to the left or right for things to like have their own space. They're not on top of each other. So that for me, that picture was not constructed, it was found. And for me, everything just sort of seemed to come into the right time, the exhaust fumes coming up and the brake light being on, and just sort of all of these things coming together.
So it has as much to do with the moment as opposed to the final composition?
Right.
Fair to say? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Caroline, I want to jump back to a question about the galleries and whatnot. And this exhibit is also running concurrently, correct, in Boston at another gallery. Can we talk about that?
Sure.
Isn't that kind of odd? And what's the relationship between your gallery and the other gallery?
Sure. So, Cig does have two shows running concurrently, but they're a different edit of the body of work.
Oh, interesting.
And in fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Cig, that in Boston they're showing metal prints. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
So Cig also prints on aluminum, and it's a very different and beautiful look for the work, and they're showing the work that way in Boston. And yes, I mean, I would agree it's not super common for two shows to run concurrently, but it is a pretty special moment for an artist to have her third monograph come out, and to have that opportunity to show this body of work in two places is extraordinary.
And my guess is that ultimately you both benefit from that.
Yeah.
It's just more people seeing the same body of work.
It's a big moment for the artist. So, they're seeing Cig's name in a lot of places.
All right, then. Very good. Can you talk a bit about, I wanted to ask you about two other artists that are, and maybe compare and contrast something with Julie Blackman and Holly Andrus, whose work maybe you can compare, obviously contrast.
Sure.
Is there something you can talk about that in terms of who the gallery looks to represent and the works themselves?
Yeah, I would say the Robert Mann Gallery has had the good fortune to champion a number of really wonderful women artists, and these three that you mentioned are, among them. And while I think that we see similarities in some of the subject matter, maybe some use of children in the pictures, domestic issues and thoughts, their approach is really, really different. So for Cig, I think we're looking often at this really fragile and fleeting moment. We're looking at a piece that implies a narrative but doesn't tell us the narrative. And I think that that's a really interesting experience for the viewer because you can come to it with a very personal feeling. I mean, I find myself all the time thinking, oh, that makes me think of this, and I have this whole sort of fairy tale story in my mind about it. Julie Blackman approaches her work in a really different way. She's really creating an entire narrative within the work. There is also, I think, that sort of implied fairy tale and a little bit of almost that element of danger a little bit, sort of lurking in the background, all these children, very few adults in the pictures. But it's she really sets up a very involved and detailed narrative in the work itself. Holly Andres is another really interesting artist. Her work, while some of the thoughts and concept are similar, she actually creates a series of images that make the narrative. So, in her most recent series, The Fallen Fawn, it is this story of these girls discovering something and what are they going to do with it. And her early series, Sparrow Lane, is the same idea, that it's really this story and these little vignettes that tell it. Of course, each image stands on its own, but it's a different experience to see it laid out like that.
Do you have a favorite photo from Cig's most recent series?
I have a lot of favorite photos from Cig's most recent series, but if I have to pick one, I would pick the blizzard on Main Street, which we used on the announcement card. Something that really sings to me about Cig's work is that it is very fragile, as we've said. It is about a fairy tale in a way, and there's a little bit of a dark element to it, I think.
Yeah.
And that work has such mystery to it. It feels like there's a whole story about to unfold, and I really love that.
Great. And Cig, last question for you, if I may. Can you tell us about the title of the book and the series?
Yeah. So all of my titles come out of my writing. And I was sat at a dinner party with a bunch of my girlfriends a year ago. And everyone around the table was going through something, either something extraordinary or something terrible. One of my friends had cancer, another friends, all different things going around the table. But if you we were there and we were laughing. And if you just looked at us from a distance, you would have no idea that these bombs and these orchestras were happening. And I just thought, well, so much in life we don't have control of. And at any one time, either of those can happen to us, and also how we respond, in our characters to when things happen to us and how we are in the world. So that's where it came from.
All right, then.
Well, that's a wrap of another fine episode. Cig Harvey, thank you so much for joining us today. People can see your work, obviously, at the Robert Mann Gallery. And what about getting your books? Where can they get your books?
From the gallery itself or my website.
Which is?
cigharvey.com or robertmann.com.
Okay. All right. And Caroline, thank you so much for joining us. Any plugs you want to give?
Yes. Well, we hope you'll come and see the show at the gallery, which runs through January 27th. And on the last day of the show, from 1 to 2 p.m. on the 27th, Cig Harvey will be there to do an artist talk.
Okay. I think we might just be there. In the meantime, we keep teasing you guys about the big Canon DSLR giveaway we're going to be having. That's coming up. And I think in the next episode, we're going to actually give you the details. All right? But be forewarned. This is a real deal camera, DSLR. We're not just giving away point and shoots here. If you are a subscriber to our podcast, may the Lord take a liking to you. And if you are not, the Lord will take a liking to you also.
We'll buy you a beer.
We'll buy you a beer, yeah. If you haven't already done so, subscribe to the B&H Photography Podcast on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or as Jason's dad prefers, Radio Public. And on behalf of Jason, John, and myself, as always, thank you so much for tuning in today.